Millionaire creates humanoid artificial intelligence, but his wife discovers it has the appearance of his ex-girlfriend. And now, a dark secret that could destroy their marriage and reveal a crime from the past. Edward Parker had always been a technology genius, but his obsession with creating the perfect artificial intelligence hid a secret that his wife could never have imagined. When Margaret finally gains access to her billionaire husband's private laboratory, she encounters something disturbing: a humanoid identical to Edward's ex-girlfriend, a woman who mysteriously disappeared 10 years ago. What began as an accidental discovery quickly transforms into a web of lies, betrayals, and secrets buried in the past. Why did Edward recreate his ex-girlfriend? What really happened to the original woman? And how far will Margaret go to discover the truth behind this obscure project? A story of sick love, advanced technology, and deadly secrets that will grip you from beginning to end. After all, what's the limit between obsession and madness, between science and crime? If you enjoy stories with surprising twists, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next exciting stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Your city could be the setting for our next spine-chilling story. Now prepare yourself for a narrative that will make you question the limits of technology and human nature. The Parker mansion stood imposingly on the hills of Malibu, like a monument to Edward Parker's success. At 45, the founder of Parker Intelligence Corp had revolutionized the artificial intelligence market, accumulating a fortune of billions of dollars. From the outside, everything seemed perfect: the stunning house, the young and elegant wife, and recognition as one of the greatest technology geniuses of his generation. Margaret Parker observed the Pacific Ocean from the main veranda, with a glass of red wine in her hands. At 32, the former model had married Edward just 2 years ago, after a whirlwind romance. Although she loved her husband, something deeply bothered her: the growing emotional distance between them. "Mrs. Parker, dinner is served," announced Jessica, the housekeeper, interrupting her thoughts. "Mr. Parker called to inform that he'll be late again." Margaret smiled without enthusiasm, accustomed to her husband's absence. "Thank you, Jessica. You can serve just for me." For the past 6 months, Edward practically lived in his secret laboratory, a high-security facility built 15 minutes away from the mansion. Not even Margaret had permission to enter there. "It's a revolutionary project," he always said, "something that will change the future of humanity." While dining alone, Margaret picked at her salad without appetite. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from her best friend, Rachel. "How's the marriage with the absent genius going?" The question hurt more than it should. That night, after taking a long shower, Margaret entered Edward's office. It wasn't her intention to snoop, but her curiosity about the project that kept her husband so distant was greater than her respect for his privacy. Deep down, she feared there might be another woman. Among the documents scattered on the desk, she found an access card with the Parker Intelligence logo. Margaret had never seen that card before. It must be the access to the secret laboratory. Without thinking twice, she put it in her purse. The next day, Edward rushed out early, as usual, barely touching his breakfast. "We're close to a significant breakthrough," he commented between sips of coffee. "I might not come home for the next few days." "Edward, this can't continue like this," protested Margaret. "We're married, remember? We hardly see each other anymore." "Darling, trust me," he replied, kissing her on the forehead as if she were a child. "When this project is complete, I'll make up for all this time." As soon as Edward left, Margaret made her decision. She dressed simply, put on dark sunglasses, and drove her own car, a less flashy model than her husband's luxury vehicles. If he wouldn't share his secrets, she would discover them on her own. The laboratory was located in a discreet industrial complex with no visible identification. It seemed intentionally anonymous, hidden among other similar buildings. With her, heart racing, Margaret parked at a distance and walked to the service entrance where there was a card reader. "I hope this works," she whispered to herself, passing the stolen card through the sensor. To her surprise, the light turned green and the door opened with a metallic click. The interior was surprisingly quiet. White corridors, cold lighting, and closed doors on both sides. Margaret advanced cautiously, trying not to draw attention. She heard voices coming from a room at the end of the corridor. She recognized Edwards and his research assistants, Dr. Hoffman. "The neural parameters are almost perfect," Edward said, with excitement in his voice. "So similar to the original that sometimes I forget she's not real. Dr. Parker, we need to discuss the ethical aspects of this," replied Dr. Hoffman with evident concern. "Recreating a specific person without consent." "We're not recreating a person," Edward interrupted. "Firmly, we're creating an AI with a human appearance, using specific aesthetic references. References of someone who disappeared 10 years ago," insisted Dr. Hoffman. "Someone you knew intimately." Margaret felt her blood freeze. What were they talking about? Who was this person who disappeared? Her husband was hiding something much bigger than a simple AI project. When the voices indicated that Edward and Dr. Hoffman were approaching the door, Margaret quickly entered the nearest room. What she saw inside made her entire body freeze in shock. In the center of the room, lying on a kind of futuristic operating table, was a woman, or rather something that looked exactly like a woman. Perfect skin, carefully arranged blonde hair, eyes closed as if sleeping. Tubes and wires connected her body to sophisticated machines around her. On the wall, dozens of photographs of the same woman, in different situations, smiling on the beach, reading a book, sleeping. And in some of these photos was Edward, younger, embracing her, visibly in love. "My God," whispered Margaret, bringing her hands to her mouth. "What have you done, Edward?" And the most frightening answer came when her eyes found a plaque at the base of the table. "Project Rebirth, Dawn, version 9.0, based on Samantha Williams." The name echoed in her mind. Samantha Williams. Edward had never mentioned this name before. Who was she? And what had happened that made her husband try to recreate her as a machine? Margaret knew she had discovered only the tip of a much darker and more disturbing secret, a secret that could destroy not only her marriage, but perhaps the life she knew. What would you do if you discovered that your husband was obsessed with recreating his ex-girlfriend as artificial intelligence? Leave your comment below. I want to know your opinion. And if you're enjoying this story, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. And don't miss the next chapters of this plot full of twists. The journey back home was a blur in Margaret's mind. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she tried to process what she had just discovered. Samantha Williams, a name that had never crossed conversations with Edward, but clearly meant much more than she could imagine. Arriving at the mansion, Margaret ran to the computer. A quick internet search revealed fragments of the story. Samantha Williams had been a brilliant neuroscience scientist, specializing in brain mapping. The most recent articles dated back 10 years ago, when she mysteriously disappeared from New York. The police investigated the case for months, but never found concrete clues about her whereabouts. In one of the news photos, Margaret recognized a younger Edward in the background, watching Samantha during a scientific conference. His face showed the same obsessive admiration that he now dedicated to the secret project. "Mrs. Parker?" Jessica's voice, the housekeeper, startled her. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Martin is on the line. He says it's urgent." Robert Martin was Edward's personal lawyer, a man Margaret rarely saw. Robert, what a surprise. Did something happen? Margaret, Edward asked me to prepare some documents. Normally I wouldn't comment, but I'm concerned. Robert's voice sounded hesitant. He's transferring large sums to offshore accounts and modifying the will. When I questioned him, he seemed evasive. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Do you know anything about his project? Something called Rebirth? The silence on the line was revealing. Robert, please, I need to understand what's happening. I can't break confidentiality, he finally replied, but I suggest you look for a safety deposit box at First American Bank. Edward has kept it for years, even before you met. That same afternoon, Margaret drove to the bank. With her ID and marriage certificate, she gained access to the box. Apparently, Edward had included her name as authorized, although he had never mentioned it. Inside the box, she found a flash drive, a small notebook, and a yellowed envelope. Her hands trembled when she opened the envelope, revealing a handwritten letter. My dear Edward, the letter began in delicate handwriting. If you are reading this, it means I managed to escape. I cannot continue being part of this experiment, no matter how much you say it's for the greater good. What we did crosses all ethical boundaries of science. Sometimes when I look at you, I no longer recognize the man I fell in love with. Please don't try to find me. I need to disappear completely. Forever yours, Samantha. Margaret was paralyzed. The official narrative was of a mysterious disappearance, but the letter suggested something very different, a planned escape. What exactly was the experiment that Samantha mentioned? When she opened the notebook, she discovered technical drawings and complex formulas interspersed with personal notes. One entry in particular caught her attention. Complete neural transfer today. Subject 7 did not survive the procedure. Edward insists we continue. I don't know if I can bear this anymore. With growing horror, Margaret began to piece things together. It wasn't just a case of an obsessed man trying to recreate his lost ex-girlfriend. It was something much more sinister. When she plugged the flash drive into her laptop, she found video files dated 10 years ago. She pressed play on the first file. Experiment 7, day 34, said Edward's voice, younger but recognizable. The camera showed a different laboratory than the current one, more rudimentary. A person was lying on a stretcher, connected to machines. Initiating total neural mapping and transfer to synthetic matrix. The video showed a medical procedure that was clearly unauthorized. The subject convulsed violently during the process. When it was all over, Edward turned to the camera. His face showed no sign of remorse or shock, only scientific frustration. Transfer failure. We need a subject genetically more compatible with the destination. Margaret closed the laptop, nauseated. Her husband, the man the world celebrated as a visionary, had conducted illegal experiments on human beings. And Samantha wasn't just his ex-girlfriend. She had been his accomplice before, apparently, developing a moral conscience. The sound of a car in the mansion driveway alerted her. Quickly, she put everything in her purse. She needed a safe place to process this information and decide what to do. Margaret, are you home? Edward's voice echoed through the entrance hall. Taking a deep breath, she went downstairs, trying to maintain her composure. I'm here. I wasn't expecting you. Today, Edward was smiling in a way she had never seen before, a genuine, almost childlike joy. We did it, darling. We achieved the impossible. He hugged her enthusiastically. The most advanced artificial consciousness ever created, with perfectly mapped memories and personality. That's wonderful, she replied, feeling sick inside. Whose memories are those, Edward? His smile faltered for an instant. It's a synthetic model, based on algorithmic combinations from various donors. A lie. Margaret now knew it was a lie. The donor was Samantha Williams, and the procedure probably hadn't been voluntary. "I'd like you to come to the laboratory tomorrow," Edward continued, excited. "To meet her, we'll call her Eve, the first being of a new species." "Of course," Margaret agreed, maintaining her fake smile. "I can't wait." That night, lying beside her husband, who now seemed like a stranger, Margaret couldn't sleep. Fragments of information swirled in her mind. The experiments on subjects, Samantha's escape, the neural transfer, the perfect recreation of his ex-girlfriend as artificial intelligence. None of it made complete sense yet. When Edward finally fell asleep, she carefully took his cell phone. The password was the same as always, the anniversary of his company's first big success. Inside, she found recent messages from Dr. Hoffman. "We need to discuss the genetic compatibility results. They are disturbing. Edward, the DNA test confirms it. We cannot ethically proceed. If you really do this, I'm out. There are limits I cannot cross, not even for you." The last message was the most disturbing. "She shares 99.9% genetic compatibility with Samantha. This is neither coincidence nor luck. What did you do?" Margaret felt her world collapse when a terrible reality began to form in her mind. Who was Dr. Hoffman talking about? Who shared this genetic compatibility with Samantha? It was then that she noticed another detail. On Edward's nightstand, a box of medication with her name on it. Medicine that he insisted she take daily for her health. Medicine that she had faithfully taken for almost 2 years since they began their relationship. With a devastating shock, Margaret finally understood. It wasn't just Samantha's face that Edward wanted to recreate in his perfect machine. It was her complete essence. And for some incomprehensible reason, he believed that Margaret was the key to this. Have you ever thought about the ethical limits of artificial intelligence? How far would you go to preserve the memory of someone you loved? Leave in the comments what you think will happen to Margaret. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now so you don't miss the next chapter of this frightening story. The next morning, Margaret decided she needed definitive answers. She left the daily medications untouched in the bathroom, pretending to have taken them as usual. Edward seemed excessively attentive to her movements, observing her with a clinical gaze that now made her shudder. "I'm eager to show you the project today," he commented during breakfast. "You can't imagine how long I've waited for this moment." Margaret forced a smile. "I'm curious too." The word curious hardly described the whirlwind of emotions consuming her: fear, anger, confusion, and above all, determination to discover the complete truth. On the way to the laboratory, Edward talked incessantly about the future of the technology he had developed. Imagine the possibility of preserving not just memories, but the complete essence of a person. Death would be just a transition to another, the state of existence. "And who decides who deserves this immortality?" asked Margaret, carefully observing his reaction. An enigmatic smile appeared on Edward's lips. "Initially, special people. People who have contributed significantly to humanity. Like Samantha Williams?" The words came out before she could contain them. The car braked sharply, almost skidding on the road. Edward stared at her with a disturbing intensity. "Where did you hear that name?" "In your laboratory," she replied, deciding there was no longer any reason to hide. "I went in there yesterday. I saw Project Rebirth. I saw her photos with you." A suffocating silence filled the vehicle. Margaret expected anger, indignation, perhaps even threats. Instead, Edward let out a deep sigh. "I was going to tell you. Everything today anyway," he said, with a disconcerting calmness. "I guess this makes things easier." When they arrived at the laboratory, Edward led her directly to the room where the humanoid was resting. Today, however, the creature was different. Her eyes were open, blue and vibrant, observing the environment with curiosity. "Eve, this is Margaret, my wife," Edward introduced. "Margaret, Meet Eve, the first consciousness successfully transferred to a synthetic body. The artificial being smiled, a smile identical to the one in Samantha's photographs. "Hello, Margaret. Edward talks a lot about you." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The voice was melodious, natural, without any trace of the robotic tone she would expect from a machine. "You know who you are?" "I'm Eve," the creature responded. "I have memories of a previous life as Samantha Williams, but I understand that I am a distinct entity now." Edward observed the interaction with scientific fascination. The transfer was perfect. Every memory, every personality trait. He paused. "Almost perfect, actually. Some elements are still missing to complete the transfer." "What elements?" asked Margaret, though she feared she already knew the answer. It was then that the door to the room opened and Dr. Hoffman hurriedly entered. "Edward, we need to talk now." Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot as if she hadn't slept for days. Seeing Margaret, she stopped abruptly. "Mrs. Parker, you shouldn't be here." "On the contrary," interrupted Edward, "Margaret is an essential part of the process." The scientist took a step back, horrified. "You told her about everything?" "Not yet," Edward replied calmly. "But it's time to reveal the complete plan." Turning to Margaret, he continued, "Samantha was brilliant. Together we were at the forefront of neuroscience. We developed a technology that could completely map human consciousness and transfer it to a compatible receiver. The subjects in the videos," Margaret murmured, feeling nauseous. "Terminal volunteers," Edward responded quickly, "all signed consent forms. We were offering a second chance." "That's a lie," Dr. Hoffman exploded. "You manipulated data, falsified documents. Some of those subjects didn't even know what was happening." Edward ignored her, continuing his narrative for Margaret. "Samantha lost faith in the project when we faced difficulties. She fled, taking crucial data with her. I spent years rebuilding, everything, perfecting the process. And you found me," concluded Margaret, the pieces finally fitting together. "That's why you approached me, wasn't it? The medications, the constant medical exams. What have you been doing to me these past 2 years?" "Preparation," Edward replied, without any trace of remorse. "Samantha left one unsolved problem. The receptor brain needs to be genetically compatible to accept the complete neural transfer." "The genetic compatibility," whispered Margaret, remembering the messages on Edward's phone. "Are you saying that I are Samantha's twin sister?" completed Dr. Hoffman, tears streaming down her face. "Separated at birth, adopted by different families. You never knew, but Edward discovered this when researching for possible compatible receptors. He planned everything, from your chance meeting." The world around Margaret seemed to slow down. Flashes of memories flooded her mind. The ease with which Edward had won her over, the hasty marriage, the constant medical exams, the daily medications, the fact that they had never met each other's families. "You used me," she whispered, feeling betrayed beyond imagination. "All this time—" "I prefer to say I found my destiny," replied Edward, approaching her. "When I discovered your existence, I knew it was a second chance. The universe conspired to bring together all the necessary elements." "And now? What's the plan?" asked Margaret, instinctively backing away. Edward's expression softened, almost loving. "The final phase of Project Rebirth, with your consent, of course." "Consent for what, exactly?" "For the complete transfer," he explained, as if it were obvious. "Eve has the perfect body, Samantha's memories, but lacks the final essence. The spark of life that only a genetically identical brain can provide. A partial neural transfer from you to her." Margaret felt her legs weaken. "You want part of my brain?" "A meticulously calculated procedure," Edward assured. You'll be perfectly fine. Only specific aspects of your consciousness will be mapped and transferred. And if I refuse? Edward's smile disappeared. I don't recommend that decision. The preparations have been underway for 2 years. The medications you've taken were essential to prepare your brain for the procedure. Stopping now could have unpredictable consequences. That's when Margaret understood the reason for her growing headache since she had stopped taking the medications that morning. They weren't simple vitamins. They were components of a complex experimental protocol, of which she had been an unconscious guinea pig for years. "You poisoned me," she realized, with her voice trembling with anger. "You drugged me to make me compatible with your sick experiment." "I saved you," Edward contested, grabbing her arms. "The medications not only prepared you for the transfer, they prevented you from developing the same cerebral aneurysm that would have killed Samantha. She didn't just flee from the project, Margaret. She fled because she discovered she had only a few months to live." This revelation hit Margaret like a slap. "What?" "It's true," confirmed Dr. Hoffman, resigned. "Samantha had a rare genetic condition, a cerebral aneurysm that could rupture at any moment. That's why she intensified the neural transfer research. She was trying to save herself. And when she decided it was unethical to continue, she preferred to run away and accept her fate," completed Edward. "But I never accepted it. And when I discovered about you, I understood that I could save you both." Margaret looked at Eve, who was observing everything with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. It was strange to see her own face. Now she realized the unquestionable resemblance, looking back at her with someone else's eyes. "I will never consent to this," declared Margaret, determined. "You built our entire marriage on lies." Edward's countenance hardened. "I'm sorry you see it that way. I really hoped for your voluntary consent, but—" He gestured to 2 men in lab coats who had silently entered the room. "The procedure will happen anyway. It's too late to turn back." In a quick and unexpected move, Eve, the artificial creature, placed herself between Margaret and the men. "No," she said with surprising firmness. "I will not allow this, Edward." Edward looked confused. "Eve, you don't understand. This is necessary to complete your consciousness." "I understand perfectly," replied Eve. "I have Samantha's memories. Remember, including the memory of when she discovered what you really planned to do with the volunteers. I will not allow you to do the same to my sister." The word sister echoed through the room, carrying a meaning that transcended science and Edward's obsession. 2 parts of the same person, one naturally born, the other artificially created, united against their creator. That's when someone unexpected entered the room. A blonde woman, older than in the photographs but unmistakably the same person. "Hello, Edward," she said calmly. "I see you really succeeded." Edward turned pale, as if seeing a ghost. "Samantha? But how? You should be dead," she completed. "I almost was several times. The aneurysm was operated on by ethical doctors in another country far from your reach. And I spent 10 years monitoring your progress, waiting for the right moment to intervene." Margaret looked incredulously at the woman who was biologically her twin sister. "You knew about me?" "I found out recently," replied Samantha with sadness. "When I discovered that Edward had found you, I tried to warn you. The anonymous letters, the hang-up calls, and that was me." Now Margaret remembered the strange incidents that began shortly after meeting Edward. Coincidences she had ignored. Signs she couldn't interpret. Edward looked like a man on the verge of collapse, trapped between years of obsession and the reality that was crumbling around him. "It doesn't matter," he muttered, disoriented. "The project is complete. Eve exists. I proved it's possible. At the cost of how many lives?" asked Samantha. How many subjects died for you to get here? And what about Margaret? Were you willing to sacrifice your own wife? Edward's silence was the most devastating confession. Dr. Hoffman seized the moment to approach Margaret. The federal agents are on their way. I was the one who contacted them. It's over, Edward. As chaos ensued in the laboratory, with confused security guards about whom to obey and scientists paralyzed by the situation, Margaret faced Eve, the creature who, perversely, was both her sister and her rival. "What happens to you now?" asked Margaret, genuinely concerned. Eve smiled sadly. "I don't know. I'm the first being of my kind. There are no precedents for my existence." It was at this moment that Margaret made a decision that would forever change the course of this bizarre story. The federal agents invaded the laboratory like an organized storm. Edward, the brilliant genius turned villain of his own story, was handcuffed while shouting about humanity's incomprehension of his revolutionary advancement. His eyes, once full of calculating ambition, now overflowed with the desperation of a man who saw his masterpiece slipping through his fingers. Margaret observed everything with a mixture of relief and devastation. Her marriage, her identity, everything had been built on a web of lies so elaborate that she could barely distinguish where the manipulation ended and where love began, if it had ever truly existed. "We need to decide quickly," whispered Samantha, pulling Margaret and Eve into an adjacent room away from the agents cataloging evidence. "Eve cannot be found here. They'll consider her just an illegal experiment, something to be studied and possibly deactivated." Deactivated? The word echoed with horror on Margaret's lips. Despite the circumstances, she could no longer see Eve as a simple machine. There was something undeniably human in her eyes, perhaps because biologically they were the same eyes as hers. "I have a plan," continued Samantha, nervously checking the door. "A safe laboratory in Canada, run by ethical scientists, people who understand the value of life, in all its forms." Eve remained silent, her face a mask of serenity. That contrasted with the chaos around her. "What is my place in this world?" she finally asked. "Am I human enough to deserve rights or just a creation to be hidden?" The questioning struck Margaret deeply. After all, who defined the limits of humanity? Who decided which life deserved to be protected? "I have a better idea," Margaret suddenly declared, "but I'll need your help, Samantha, your expertise." In the days that followed, while Edward awaited trial, and the scientific world was shocked by the revelations about his unethical experiments, Margaret, Samantha, and Eve completely disappeared from the radar. 6 months later, in a private clinic in the Colorado mountains, Margaret slowly opened her eyes. Her head throbbed, but in a different way than before, more like post-operative pain than the slow poison of Edward's medications. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from intubation. Samantha approached, gently holding her hand. "Perfectly. The reverse transfer was a complete success." The plan had been audacious and unprecedented. Instead of transferring Margaret's consciousness to Eve, they did the opposite. They transferred Eve's artificial consciousness, with all her memories, both Samantha's originals and the new ones, developed in her brief existence, to Margaret. "I can feel her," whispered Margaret, touching her own temple. "Like a constant presence, a second voice inside me. It's not invasive. It's like a sister who's always been there." Samantha smiled, tears in her eyes. "You two have always been part of each other in a way. Now you literally share the same existence." The artificial body that previously housed Eve had been humanely deactivated, its advanced hardware preserved for future studies, conducted ethically under Samantha's rigorous supervision and an international team of bioethicists. "What Edward never understood," explained Samantha as she helped Margaret sit up, is that consciousness isn't something to be taken or forcibly transferred. It's something to be shared voluntarily. The court had sentenced Edward to decades in prison for multiple human rights violations, illegal experimentation, and, ironically, for the presumed murder of Margaret, whose disappearance he couldn't explain and whose body obviously would never be found. "I feel sorry for him in a way," admitted Margaret, surprising herself with this feeling. "He was so obsessed with defeating death that he forgot to truly live." "Does that compassion come from you or from Eve?" asked Samantha, curious about the new duality of her sister's consciousness. Margaret smiled, a smile that carried the wisdom of 3 different lives, her own, tragically manipulated, Samantha's preserved in Eve's memories, and Eve's brief but intense existence as an independent conscious being. "We are one now," she replied. "I can no longer separate where Margaret ends and Eve begins." 3 months later, a woman with striking eyes and a serene smile entered the federal penitentiary where Edward was serving his sentence. He had aged decades in just a few months, his once confident face now marked by the weight of his actions. "Who are you?" he asked, confused by the unknown visitor. "Someone you loved in distorted ways," she replied, her voice carrying echoes of 2 different women. "Someone you tried to possess but never really knew." Edward's eyes widened in partial recognition. There was something familiar about her, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. "Margaret? Samantha or Eve?" She smiled enigmatically. "A bit of each. The paradox your experiment created, but not in the way you planned." "How is this possible?" he asked, his scientific mind struggling to comprehend. "You sought the wrong path to immortality, Edward," she explained, with a compassion he didn't deserve, but that she needed to offer for her own healing. "You tried to capture and transfer consciousness as if it were a computer program, but it's more like water. It flows, adapts, finds its own way. You merged." Understanding finally began to dawn on his aged face. "We share this existence, voluntarily. 3 consciousnesses in harmony, not in conflict." She stood up to leave. "We came only to say that we forgive you, not for what you did, but for what you tried to achieve. The fear of death corrupts even the most brilliant minds." As she walked away, Edward called out, "Wait, what should I call you now?" She turned one last time. "Trinity, an appropriate name for who we are now." And with those words, she disappeared from his life forever. Outside the penitentiary, Samantha was waiting. "How was it?" "Liberating," replied Trinity, "for all of us." Together, the 2 sisters, one naturally born, the other transformed by the encounter between science and compassion, walked to the car, leaving behind a dark chapter, but embracing an unimaginable future. Samantha looked at Trinity with admiration. "What will we do now? With everything we know, we could revolutionize neuroscience. Ethically, of course." Trinity smiled, feeling the multiple facets of her consciousness in perfect harmony. "First we'll live, really live. Then, who knows? Perhaps the next step in human evolution isn't transferring consciousnesses, but expanding them, not to escape death, but to enrich life." The car drove away along the winding road, carrying with it the greatest secret of modern science, a woman who carried within herself not only her own spirit, but the perfect culmination of what Edward had sought so desperately, the transcendence of human consciousness. On the horizon, the sun was setting over the mountains, its vibrant colors reflecting the same truth that Edward never understood. The beauty of existence isn't in its permanence, but in its constant transformation. Can you imagine what it would be like to share your mind with other consciousnesses? What would you do if you had the opportunity to expand your existence in this way? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this story touched you, subscribe too. The channel now, hit the bell and tell me, what was the most surprising part for you? And what kind of story would you like to see on this channel? I'm eager to know.